Welcome. If you're gearing up for the PCI CP certification, there's one thing you absolutely have to understand: the power of the payment brands. Let's get right to it. A merchant can have a QSA give them a perfect report card, but if a payment brand looks at it and says nope, then that merchant is not compliant. It's that simple. In this explainer, we're going to dig deep into the expert material to really unpack that absolute authority. We'll look at the brands themselves, their own unique compliance programs, and exactly what they do to protect the entire payment system. All right, here's our game plan. We're going to start at the very beginning with the Council of Guardians, why these huge competitors even needed to team up in the first place. Then we'll meet the powerhouse brands one by one. After that, we'll dive into their individual security programs. Think of these as their specific rule books. From there, we'll get into their guardian duties, which is what they do day in and day out. And finally, we'll tie it all together to understand their ultimate authority and why they have the final say on everything.
So before we can even talk about the individual brands, we've got to understand the council they created. This is so important because without this council, the PCI DSS as we know it today just wouldn't exist. It's the bedrock of standardized payment security, and it was born out of some serious chaos.
I want you to just imagine for a second that you're a merchant back in the early 2000s. It was the Wild West. Visa might have had one rule for your firewalls, while MasterCard had a totally different one for encryption. And then American Express comes along with its own policy on how long you need to keep your logs. You could be perfectly compliant with one, and that would actually make you non-compliant with another. It was a mess. And worse, it was a huge security risk that attackers were just dying to exploit. Something had to change. And so these 5 massive global competitors did something pretty amazing. They actually collaborated. They came together to form the Payment Card Industry's Security Standards Council, the PCI SSC. Now, this is a critical point to remember. The council's job is to own and develop the standards, PCI DSS, PADSS, all of that. They also handle training for assessors like QSAs and ASVs. But, and you really need to get this, the council itself has zero power to enforce anything. They write the rule book, but they can't hand out penalties. That power belongs only to the brands themselves. So, the council makes the standards, but the brands have all the real power. Now, let's get properly introduced to these guardians. We've talked about the 5 founders, but the group has actually grown. And you need to know who these 6 players are, because they're the ones who will ultimately decide if an organization is compliant or not. That's right, 6. There are 6 brands calling the shots today. 5 of them were there from the very beginning, laying the foundation for everything. But a 6th brand joined more recently, and that move really reflects just how much the global economy has shifted. Let's go through each one and see what makes them tick.
First up, American Express. As a founder, they were in the room helping write the rules from day one. What makes Amex a little different is what's called their closed-loop network. So unlike Visa or MasterCard, who have separate banks for issuing cards and handling merchant accounts, Amex often does it all. They are the issuer, the acquirer, and the network. This gives them a direct line to both the cardholder and the merchant, which is a huge deal for compliance. It means they can enforce PCI DSS directly, giving them incredible control over their network.
Next, we have Discover, another one of the original founders. Now, they might have a different market focus than, say, Visa or MasterCard, but their role on the council is just as important. They bring a really essential perspective to the table, making sure the DSS framework works for different kinds of business models and networks. Their compliance program is a huge part of maintaining security for the millions of merchants who take Discover cards. Then there's JCB International, which is based in Japan. Their involvement as a founder was absolutely fundamental. It made sure that PCI DSS wasn't just some standard cooked up in a North American or European bubble. They provided a critical perspective on the payment technologies and business practices in Asia, which made the standard truly global right from the start. And of course, MasterCard. Their Site Data Protection Program, or SDP, is one of the most famous enforcement programs out there. The SDP program is basically MasterCard's playbook. It's how they sort merchants into different levels based on how many transactions they do, define what each level needs to do to prove they're compliant, and manage all the paperwork. For tons of companies, the deadlines from the SDP program drive their whole PCI effort for the year. And Visa. Okay, here's a key detail you'll want to remember for your certification. Visa has a unique dual program approach. So Visa Inc., which covers most of the globe, runs the Cardholder Information Security Program, or CISP. But Visa Europe, which for a long time was its own separate thing, runs the Account Information Security Program, or AIS. Now, they both enforce the exact same PCI DSS, but they can have different reporting rules, different deadlines, and different fines, reflecting things like GDPR in Europe. And that brings us to the sixth and newest guardian, UnionPay. Their addition as a strategic member back in 2020 was a huge deal for the council. I mean, with hundreds of millions of cards out there and a transaction volume that's right up there with the other big brands, not having them at the table would have left a massive hole in global security. Their involvement ensures the PCI standards stay relevant for the entire modern payment ecosystem. Okay, so we've met the six guardians. Now we need to look at their individual rulebooks. This is one of the most important concepts to get right, and honestly, it's where a lot of people get tripped up. There is one standard, the PCI DSS, but there are multiple enforcement programs. Let's break down exactly what that means. The best way to think about it is like this. The PCI SSC is like a global government that writes one universal law. That law is the PCI DSS. But that government doesn't have its own police force. So the individual payment brands are like different countries that all agree to uphold that universal law. Each country, or brand, uses its own police and its own court system, that's their compliance program, to enforce it. The law is the same for everybody, but how it's enforced, the fines, the deadlines, the paperwork, that's specific to each country's program. This table right here, this is pure gold for your certification studies. It lays it all out. As we just talked about, you can see Visa's split, CISSP and AIS. Then you've got MasterCard's well-known SDP program. American Express calls theirs the Data Security Operating Policy, or DSOP. And JCB has their Data Security Program. They all point back to the same PCI DSS, but knowing which specific program you have to report to is absolutely critical. All right, so we have the guardians and we have the rulebooks, but enforcement isn't just a document. It's an active, ongoing job. So what does a brand actually do to manage compliance for millions of merchants all over the world? Let's break down their core day-to-day responsibilities. They're responsible for a lot. First off, tracking and enforcement. They're not just crossing their fingers and hoping merchants are compliant, they're actively tracking it. Then, they're the ones setting the penalties and deadlines. If a merchant isn't compliant, the brands give the acquiring banks the power to levy fines, and those can be thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars a month. They also manage the whole validation process. They decide who needs a full-blown on-site assessment and a report on compliance, and who can get by with a self-assessment questionnaire. They also approve and post the official lists of compliant service providers. And finally, and this is huge, they're the ones who define the merchant and service provider levels, usually based on transaction volume, which dictates exactly how rigorous the whole validation process needs to be. This life cycle makes their authority perfectly clear. Look at step 1, define. The brands kick off the entire process by setting the rules. Then, in step 2, the assess part is done by QSAs and ASVs. In step 3, the paperwork gets submitted. But then look at what happens at the end. Step 4, approve. This is where the brands come back in. They review the QSA's work and they have the final say. A QSA can't declare a company compliant, only a brand can do that. And then in step 5, list. The brand makes it official. They're the beginning and the end of this entire process. And that brings us to the single most important idea you need to walk away with. If the PCI SSC writes the music, the standard itself, then the brands are the conductors. They interpret that music and they lead the whole orchestra. Their power is absolute. So let's look at what that ultimate authority actually means in the real world. This quote from the expert material just says it all. You can have a highly trained, certified QSA, spend weeks on site with a client, and produce a 1,000-page report on compliance. But at the end of the day, that report is basically just a recommendation. The brands are the final judges. They can look at that ROC and say, you know what, we don't think this testing was thorough enough, and they can reject it. The QSA makes a recommendation, the brand makes the decision. Period. And their authority doesn't stop with merchants. It actually extends to the assessors themselves. This is a really key distinction. The PCI SSC, the council, they handle the certification of the individual assessors, the people. But the payment brands, they manage the approval of the QSA companies. A business can't just hire a bunch of certified people and start doing assessments. They have to go through a whole approval process with the brands to become a trusted QSA company. This gives the brands quality control over the entire ecosystem. So this entire structure is designed to prevent data breaches. But, prevention isn't always foolproof. So what happens when things go wrong? Well, it's during a crisis, a data compromise, that the brand's authority becomes the most visible and the most powerful. When a breach happens, the brands take charge. They are the ones who mandate that the breach company hire a PCI forensic investigator, or a PFI. The brands define the rules for that investigation to make sure it's done right. And the PFI doesn't just report their findings to the client, they report directly to the payment brands. As the expert material points out, PCI SSC FAQ 1142 is the place to go for this. It has the specific data breach contacts for every brand. If you're a compliance pro, you should have that page bookmarked.
So let's wrap this up. We've seen that the brands are the founders, they're the enforcers, and they're the ultimate judges. They're the true guardians of our payment data. And the single most important thing to take away from all this is that compliance is not a conversation with the PCI Council, it is a conversation with the payment brands. Understanding their programs, their authority, and how they enforce the rules isn't just theory, it's the absolute core of any successful PCI compliance strategy. As you move forward, always ask yourself, what would the brands require?